Welcome to Channel 17, the Town of Colonie Government Channel.
Welcome again. My name is Robert Jakeway. I'm the director of the library, and we are today on the 143rd anniversary of the assassination of President Abraham Lincoln, going to have a very special presentation. I recall now the day that Matthew Sissman came up to me. I believe I was at the reference desk, and he was talking to me about this particular book, which is Manhunt, The 12-Day Chase for Lincoln's Killer by James Swanson. And he was talking about it, and in the course of that discussion, this whole process evolved, and obviously he knew a lot about the subject and was an enthusiast. And we arranged to have him give this presentation tonight. So I think we're very fortunate indeed. Matthew D. Sissman is a resident of the town of Colonie. He's a Shaker graduate. And he's also on the board of trustees for the library. He's the secretary of the library board. So you didn't come here to hear me tonight. You came here to hear Matthew Sissman and his talk about Abraham Lincoln. So I'll give the podium over to Matthew Sissman. Thank you.
Thank you, Robert. It's nice to be here. And before I get started with the presentation, I just want to get an important plug-in for the Wolf Road book that the assistant director of the library, Mr. Naylor, has written with Gene and Peter Platt. The library is selling them, and it's a great look at the history of the town and the development of Wolf Road. So you can borrow mine to take a look at it if you'd like. The library is selling them, and I understand they're on order, but we are taking a list of people who are interested in purchasing the book. The book Manhunt, which came out about 3 years ago, give or take, concentrates on the 12-day period between the assassination of President Lincoln and the capture of the killing of Booth and the capture of his accomplice. Next slide, please. I think it's important to point out at the outset that at the time that Lincoln was killed, the country was sharply divided. This map shows us the political scene of the various states. The red states at the top of the page are all the Union states, and the green states at the bottom of the page are the Confederate states, and in particular, the states of the Deep South, which are the darkest green, were the states that all seceded when Lincoln was president-elect, and then 4 states seceded after the fall of Fort Sumter for a total of 11 states. And there were 5 states that were border states that remained loyal to the Union, but also permitted slavery within their borders, and they were Missouri, Kentucky, West Virginia, Maryland, and Delaware. And what's particularly important about Maryland, where a lot of the action takes place, is that Abraham Lincoln literally threw Maryland state legislators in jail to protect Maryland's status as a Union state and to prevent the Maryland state legislature from authorizing any secession legislation, because if that had happened, the nation's capital would have been completely surrounded by rebel territory. So these were viewed by certain people as gross abuses of power, and Lincoln was seen as a tyrant and loathed by many people in many parts of the country. And it's only from our perspective now where he's viewed in a very different light. And ironically, it was Booth's act of murder, which he viewed as a grand gesture, a heroic gesture against tyranny, that resulted in this transformation of Lincoln from a person who was widely loathed by many people in many parts of the country to a person who was much more celebrated. Next slide, please. This is the scene of Lincoln's second inauguration, and the Booth is located somewhere in this picture. He was actually on the scene as he was an invited guest of Lucy Hale, who was his secret fiancée. She also was a daughter of a senator, and they tell us that Booth is lurking somewhere up in here. The images are kind of blurry, but Booth would later remark that he had had a wonderful opportunity to kill the president on this day had he chosen to take advantage of that. Another interesting thing about this whole chapter is it takes place, and it's kind of a reenactment of the Passion Play. The surrender of Grant to Lee at Appomattox Courthouse takes place on Palm Sunday, 1865, and this effectively ends any notion that the South has of seceding from the country. Lincoln on April the 11th, and the scene in Washington, D.C. breaks out in celebration because it's clear that the war is coming to an end and people are going to be able to get on with their lives and things are going to return to a state of normalcy. So tremendous celebrations break out in Washington, D.C. On April 11th, Lincoln gives an address from above the main entrance to the White House. Turns out to be the last speech that he'll give in public. And rather than celebrating the end of the war, he starts to talk about the Reconstruction. And it's kind of an extension of the second inaugural address. And he lays out his ideas. It's a very poignant scene because it's a dimly lit scene. And by dim light, he's reading this manuscript. And as he finishes with each leaf, he tosses it aside, and it gently wafts to the ground where his son Tad, at his feet, picks it up and collects it. Booth is on the scene listening to this address, and at one point, Lincoln mentions that he sees freed blacks being given the right to vote. And Booth is a horrible racist. He doesn't take to this idea too well, and in language it's too harsh to publicly share, you can imagine. He says, that means citizenship. Now, by God, I'll put him through. Walking away in disgust. He says that to David Harold, who's his accomplice and guide. Walking away in disgust, he sees another conspirator, Lewis Powell, and he says, that's the last speech he'll ever give. So at that point, his mind has shifted. He had an original plan to kidnap Lincoln, which we'll get to later. Can I see the next slide, please? This is the famous crack plate portrait, one of the last made of Lincoln by Alexander Gardner. In the process of developing the plate, it was cracked. He made one print of this and then destroyed the negative. And it's kind of eerily prescient in that it foretells perhaps the president's death. The crack in the plate is very near to where in his head the mortal wound was suffered. And in particular, we can see the toll that the war has taken on the president by looking at his features. Next slide, please. This is the route that Booth took during his escape. And you can see it takes place over 12 days and involves various locations, both in Maryland and Virginia. Next slide, please. This is the star of the show, John Wilkes Booth, murder of President Lincoln. He was a nationally renowned actor at the time from a prominent acting family. He also had been an ardent Southern sympathizer and in fact was a spy for the Confederacy. His professional status as an actor allowed him to travel all across the country without questions being raised. And he also was a pub crawler. He enjoyed the nightlife. He enjoyed hanging out in bars and pubs. And so he was in a position to hear bits and pieces of information that were freely discussed to him and around him in locations where alcohol was a nice lubricant to get those bits and pieces of information flying. He did, however, retire from acting to fully devote himself to his Southern sympathies. He did make one appearance with his two acting brothers in New York City. It was a production of Julius Caesar, and ironically, the production was stopped in the middle because there was an unsuccessful attempt by Confederate spies to unleash Greek fire in New York City to provide terrorism to the North. In October of 1864, Booth ventured to Canada and met with a Confederate agent named Patrick Charles Martin. And this is when he was developing this plan in his head to kidnap Lincoln and use kind of a reverse underground railroad to, through a network of safe houses, spirit Lincoln off to the Deep South where they would be able to try and extract some benefit from the North. So he meets with Charles Martin, and Martin gives him the name of 2 Confederate sympathizers in Charles County, Maryland, that he can use to try and further this plan. And also, he gives Booth letters of introduction to these 2 individuals so that they know that this is a man of sincere loyalties. The 2 sympathizers are Dr. William Queen and Dr. Samuel Mudd. And Booth had met with Dr. Queen in November of 1864 and spent the night at his house. And the following morning at St. Mary's Church in Bryantown, they meet with Dr. Mudd. And on a subsequent occasion, he met again with Dr. Mudd and actually spent the night enjoying Dr. Mudd's hospitality at his home prior to the assassination. So the notion that Dr. Mudd was a kindly country doctor who happened to be a good Samaritan when a sick caller came is folklore. It's not historical fact. The morning of Friday, April 14th, he learns that Abraham Lincoln will be attending Ford's Theater. And he's already had in his mind the kidnap plot idea. He now has converted it to a killing idea, and so he scrambles in short notice, knowing where the president's going to be, to put his plan into effect. He has a meeting later in the day, but first he stops at the Sarat boarding house, and he finds out from Mary Sarat that she's going to be making a trip to Saratsville, now Clinton, Maryland, where there's a Sarat tavern that she inherited. And when he hears that she's going to be making this trip, he asks her to deliver a package for him, and it's sealed, it contains some binoculars. And he also asks her to relay a message that the firing irons, the guns that were secreted there earlier in connection with a failed kidnap plot, should be made ready because he's going to be calling for them this evening. So Mary Sarat makes that trip and delivers that message. Booth also sends his assistant, David Herold, to round up the rest of the crew. He sends Herold off to bring George Atzerodt for the meeting. And the other thing that he does is he writes a letter. And again, he's an actor, and he has a tremendous flair for the dramatic, and he sees this as a very heroic act, and he wants to make sure that he gets the credit for all of this. So he writes the following letter that he sends to be published. For a long time, I have devoted my energies, my time, and money to the accomplishment of a certain end. I've been disappointed. The moment has arrived when I must change my plans. Many will blame me for what I'm about to do, but posterity, I'm sure, will justify me. Men who love their country better than gold and life. And to this note, he signs John W. Booth, Payne Herold Atzerodt. So he signs his own name, and he signs the name of 3 of the conspirators. Next slide, please. This is David Herold. Note here that he's wearing a restraint. These guys, after they were captured, became kind of a national carnival. They took pictures of them, they paraded them around in public for the public to see for amusement. Herold was Booth's loyal assistant. He was a native of the Washington, D.C. area, and he was an experienced outdoorsman. He was Booth's companion and guide, and his multiple jobs during the plot and the aftermath were to serve as a guide to both Booth and Maryland in the Maryland countryside, but also to Lewis Powell in Washington, D.C., and in the Maryland countryside. Powell was the person assigned the responsibility of assassinating Secretary of State Seward. Herold was a pharmacist's assistant, and he was very familiar with the way that medicines were prepared, and in particular, how they were packaged when they were sent. And this was a ruse that was used to gain entry into the Seward home. Seward had had an accident and was recuperating from an accident, and Lewis Powell shows up claiming to have a delivery of medicine from Dr. Verdi, who was Secretary of State Seward's attending physician. Earlier in the day of the assassination, as I said earlier, Herold called on George Atzerodt at the Kirkwood house where he was staying to summon him to Booth's meeting at the Herndon house for the final discussion of the plan. He also delivered to Atzerodt important evidence that would remain in the room and that would link him without question to the conspiracy. He was tried as a conspirator in a military tribunal and hanged where today stands Fort Leslie J. McNair. Next slide. This is Lewis Powell, also known as Lewis Payne. He was the attempted assassin of William H. Seward. He was recruited to be the muscle of the gang. He's a very, very strong guy. He was viewed as strong enough to subdue Abraham Lincoln because Lincoln himself was a very sturdy man. He was a native of Alabama, and at the time of all this, he was a resident of Florida. So he was not familiar with Washington, D.C. and the area around the Capitol, and that's why Harold was charged with the responsibility of helping him to find his way out of the town. And it's an interesting story. He doesn't make it, and we'll get to that later. He was also tried as a conspirator and hanged at Fort McNair, what today is Fort McNair. Next slide. George Atzerodt, he was willing to join the conspiracy at first to kidnap Lincoln, and then he balked when the plan changed and he was told that he would be responsible for killing Vice President Johnson. And he could have turned the entire gang in, but he didn't. Booth tells him that if he doesn't carry out his assigned task, Booth would make sure that he would be implicated and he would hang anyway. So he goes, and part of his story is more laudable than the rest because he has enough of a conscience that he can't go through with his assigned task, but he also doesn't do anything about it to prevent it from happening. He's staying at the same hotel with Vice President Andrew Johnson, the Kirkwood House. At that time, the vice presidency office did not have official residence as a part of the job, so Johnson rented a room at the Kirkwood House. And one of the other errands that Booth did that morning was he left a note at the Vice President Johnson's hotel asking him if he could see him. And nothing more than that, so it's kind of one of those little quirks that historians have been wondering what the purpose of that meeting might have been. And as I said earlier, he receives a delivery of materials from David Harold that remain in the room, this treasure trove of evidence. Included in the evidence is a revolver, a loaded and capped revolver underneath the pillow, and in between the sheets and the mattress, a large Bowie knife, also a brass spur, a pair of socks, 2 shirt collars, a pair of new gauntlets, 3 boxes of cartridges, a piece of licorice, and a toothbrush. There's a black coat also hung from a hook on the wall, and in the pockets of the coat they find a map of the state of Virginia and 3 handkerchiefs, one of which is embroidered with the name Mary R. Booth, John Wilkes Booth's mother. And also included, most damning evidence, is a bank book from the Ontario Bank in Montreal showing a credit balance of $455 in the name of J. Wilkes Booth. So under questioning after capture, he implicates both Mrs. Sarat and Dr. Mudd in the plot and in the conspiracy. He's tried in the military tribunal and hanged at Fort McNair. Next slide. Mary Sarat, widow of John Sarat, inherited both the boarding house in Washington, D.C., where the conspirators met to hatch the original plot to kidnap Lincoln, and also inherited a tavern in Surrattsville. And I said earlier, she serves as an emissary and delivers necessary package and information. And she also was hanged at Fort McNair. And a lot of people questioned whether or not she was involved. And one of the reasons I think she was hanged was that her son escaped the dragnet, and her son was a Confederate agent also. Next slide. Samuel Arnold, he was involved in the original plot to kidnap Lincoln, and 2 attempts to do so failed when the president was not where they expected him to be at the time that they expected him to be there. He dropped out of the conspiracy, but in Booth's hotel room after the assassination was found a letter from Sam which pointed to a conspiracy and implicated Mike as well. The letter also made reference to Baltimore, Maryland. So he was also tried as a conspirator, and he was sentenced to life imprisonment at Fort Jefferson at Dry Tortugas. He's pardoned in 1869 by President Johnson and released along with the rest, Spangler and Mudd, and he was with John Sarat, the only conspirator to live into the 20th century. Next slide, please. This is Michael O'Loughlin, a childhood friend of John Wilkes Booth, lived across the street from the Booth family in Baltimore. He was one of the earliest recruits to the conspiracy to kidnap. and he agreed to participate in the fall of 1864. He met with Booth in March 15 of 1865 to discuss the kidnap plot, and he was sentenced to life imprisonment at Fort Jefferson. He passes away a victim of the yellow fever epidemic that Dr. Mudd is able to gain some salvation by helping to quell. Next slide, please. Dr. Mudd. It's a documented historical fact that Mudd met at least twice with John Wilkes Booth prior to the night that he set his leg. In late 1864, Booth is scouting locations near Mudd's farm to find safe houses and Confederate sympathizers who will help in his plot to kidnap Lincoln. It's also a documented fact that Mudd met with Booth and John Sarat in Washington, D.C. Some accounts say that Mudd was the agent that introduced them, and some accounts say that Mudd was there just as another party, but what's clearly a fact is that Mudd was there. It's probable at the time that he set Booth's leg that he did not know that Booth had murdered the president. He allowed Booth and his companion Harold to stay at the farm until the afternoon of April the 15th, and on that occasion, without question, he knew what had happened because he went into town, and the town was abuzz. The government was already mobilizing in this hunt, so he clearly heard about what had happened. And when he returned, Booth and Harold leave the farmhouse. And beyond that, Mudd now delays in sharing appropriate information with the manhunters. He provides inaccurate information, partial information. He gives statements that just are bizarre because they really don't make sense. And eventually, he admits, and one of the things, too, a piece of evidence is left behind. In the course of fixing Booth's leg, he cuts off a boot that belongs to Booth that remains at the house and becomes a piece of physical evidence that proves, without question, that he served the president's assassin that night. Next slide, please. This is Edmund Spangler. This guy, I think, is the most innocent of all of them. He was a carpenter and scene shifter at Ford's Theater. And earlier in his life, he had worked for the Booth family, doing odd jobs, and he was previously acquainted with John Wilkes Booth because of that, and because of his work at the theater. Early on the morning of April the 14th, he's asked by his employer, John T. Ford, to prepare the state box for an anticipated visit by the president that evening. So he removes a partition that converts the two boxes into one, and he moves furniture in and other decorations for the special occasion. Now, Booth asks him on that night to hold his horse, because the horse that Booth has is a temperamental creature and can't be left alone tied to a hitching post. But he can't do it because he's got to move the scenery around and tend to his duties during the performance. So he passes the task along of handling Booth's horse to John Peanuts Burroughs, who's a junior stagehand. His long-standing previous association with Booth and the theater do him in. He's arrested and charged with being part of the conspiracy when a long length of sturdy rope is found in his quarters. And under ordinary circumstances, this would be a perfectly ordinary, expected piece of apparatus that a stagehand would have. But in the connection with the assassination, with Booth's leap from the box, they make the case that maybe this was supposed to be an aid for Booth to climb down. So he's given the lightest sentence. He's sentenced to 6 years. He also is pardoned by President Johnson. And interestingly, he befriends Dr. Mudd during their imprisonment. And at the time of his death, Mudd had taken him in onto the farm and given him a piece of land to farm. So Mudd looked after him after their imprisonment, as Dr. Mudd felt that Spangler had helped save his life in the prison. Next slide. John Sarat, Mary Sarat's son, who was a Southern sympathizer, worked as a spy, gathering intelligence about Union activities. He met previously with Booth and Mudd, as I indicated. He's the one member of the conspiracy who eludes the dragnet. He eludes the manhunt. He flees to Canada, and he stays out of the country throughout the trial and execution of his mother. And he winds up traveling on forged papers with forged names until he's finally caught in Egypt, of all places. And he's brought back to the United States on a warship. And interestingly, in the wake of the assassination, a military tribunal was the vehicle for dispensing justice. Subsequent to that, there were court cases, and I believe the Supreme Court held, I don't know the exact case, but the Supreme Court made a decision subsequent to that trial that when the civilian courts were open, they had to be used rather than the military tribunal. So when he comes back, he's given a trial, a criminal trial in a civilian court, using much of the same evidence that's used against his mother and the other conspirators. And his trial actually ends in a hung jury. 4 votes to convict and 8 to acquit. So the government drops its charges against him. They don't charge him again. And he spends the rest of his life as a free man and a model citizen, although at one point he does, kind of in a tacky way, try to cash in on his association with the conspiracy by doing a paid lecture series. And this doesn't really go too well. And he's the last of the conspirators to die in April of 1916. Next slide shows him as an old man. I'm not sure what the date of this photo is. And the next panel shows the 2 pictures side by side. Next slide, please. This is Louis Weichman. He's a boarder at the Sarat rooming house in Washington, and he provided sworn testimony implicating Mrs. Sarat. He actually made the ride out to the tavern with Mrs. Sarat that morning, so he corroborated that she, in fact, had made that trip. And interestingly, there was a backlash against him after the execution of Mrs. Sarat. There were lingering doubts about whether or not he had told the truth. So he took the unusual step of swearing out an additional statement just before his death, in which he reaffirmed that everything that he had said before had been the truth. Next slide, please. On the left side, you see a picture of the Sarat boarding house that was made in 1890, about 25 years after the conspirators met there. The right side is a contemporary picture. You see the 2 buildings are pretty much the same. It now is the home of the Wok and Roll Chinese fast food restaurant. I don't make this up. That's in fact the case. Next slide, please. This is the historic marker on the building. Sarat Boarding House, 604 H Street, said to have been where the conspirators plotted the abduction of U.S. President Abraham Lincoln in 1865. Next slide, please. This is a poster outside Ford's Theater advertising the evening's performance. You'll see up here it says, benefit, last night, Miss Laura Keene. And what the benefit was that was an interesting thing that they did back then, where they would dedicate and donate a disproportionate amount of the gate to a particular actor. So they would say, benefit, Laura Keene, she would get a certain percentage, a disproportionate percentage of the gate. And this way, the public, the customers, would know that if one of their favorites was having a benefit on one night, they would go to the theater on that night and that person would receive the reward for their attendance. Next slide. This is a shot of Ford's Theater then. Next slide. A shot of Ford's Theater decorated after the assassination. You can see the bunting all over the building. And it's interesting, there was a kind of a crazy attitude where the theater itself was viewed as the source of all of the misery that occurred there. And the theater was shut down, the Ford brothers were thrown into jail, and in fact the theater was not used as a theater for over 100 years. They had the insides ripped out, they turned it into an office building, and it was only around the centennial of the events that the decision was made to refurbish and reopen the theater. Next slide, please. Another shot of Ford's Theater, this time looking today. Next slide. And then 2 shots of then and now. Next. This is a shot diagramming the path that Booth took. We have here the audience, the edge of the stage, the presidential box here in the corner. He sneaks up behind. He actually put a bar. There were 2 doors. And the next slide, I think, shows you that. There's this door here, which is the doorway into the foyer leading into the box. And Booth actually wedges a bar behind that to make sure that it's more difficult for anyone to get in. And then he hides here waiting for the right moment. And Booth was intimately, as an actor, intimately familiar with the layout of the theater. He also was intimately familiar with the structure and flow of the play Our American Cousin. And he knew that at a certain point there was going to be delivered a line which was going to result in uproarious laughter throughout the theater that would help mask the report of the Derringer. And by a coincidence, after that line was delivered, there'd only be one actor on the stage. So this was the moment when he should act, because the shot of the gun would be muffled, and then there'd only be one actor on the stage that would be an obstruction to him working his way across the stage. Next slide, please. This is the alley behind the theater where he made his escape. Next slide. Now, this is the list of guests that the Lincolns invited to the theater. There's a local connection to the story. Clara Harris and her father were Loudonville residents, and it's accidental that she winds up becoming a guest of the Lincolns at the theater. The first guests asked to come were General and Mrs. Grant. They left for Washington, and Mrs. Grant was not a big fan of Mrs. Lincoln because Mrs. Lincoln called her husband a butcher. So they didn't see eye to eye, and they were going north. Remember, it was a holiday weekend. Easter was Sunday. So they were traveling north to visit the children. And other people may have declined because they felt going to the theater on Good Friday was an inappropriate pursuit. They would not necessarily have told that to the Lincolns, but that might be one of the reasons why the list of rejections is so long. Next slide, please. Edwin M. Stanton and wife. They didn't give this as the reason, and I'm telling you that was the reason. Mrs. Stanton and Mary Todd Lincoln didn't get along, so the Stantons declined the invitation. Next slide. Thomas Eckert was a telegraph officer in the War Department. He had to remain at work because there were cables that were coming back and forth still regarding war business, even though the war was over, so he couldn't attend the theater. Next slide. Schuyler Colfax, at the time Speaker of the House, later President Grant's vice president. He turned down the invitation as he was leaving for the Pacific Coast the following day. Next slide. George Ashman of Massachusetts had presided over the convention that nominated Lincoln for president. He turned down the theater invitation on the grounds of a previous engagement. Next slide. Oglesby was the sitting governor. This is one of the most poignant parts of the story. Sitting governor of Illinois declined the invitation in order to visit other friends, but he told Lincoln he would be back to see him over the weekend. So imagine how he felt having missed that opportunity. Next slide. Yates, ex-governor of Illinois, excused himself because he had other appointments with friends. Next slide. General Isham N. Haney, visitor from Illinois, used the same excuse, previous engagement with other friends. Next slide. William A. Howard, postmaster of Detroit, had already made arrangements to leave Washington later that day, so he declined. Mr. and Mrs. William H. Wallace, governor of Ohio Territory, they said they were too tired to go to the theater. Noah Brooks was a reporter who'd always been friendly to the Lincoln administration. He couldn't go to the theater because he had a cold. And the last is Robert Todd Lincoln, their son, their oldest son, their only son to survive into adulthood. He had returned because he was on a tour with Grant, tour of duty with General Grant, and he describes his father asking him, and he wanted to retire. And Tad, then 12, and you can imagine this, you know, a young kid being sorry that he's not one of the big people, and he sees an invitation extended to his older brother and not extended to him. So he says nobody ever asked him to go. So he winds up going to see Aladdin that night, and you think maybe they said to him, all right, well, you can't come with us, but here's a theater thing that we'll send you off to see this. So to me, the thing that's striking is there's a possibility that if they made a different decision, he might have been in the box too with his father at the night of this awful, awful occasion. And then he was at Grover's, and when the news comes that he's shot, the president is shot, Tad is immediately taken home and put to bed. Next slide, please. This is Clara Harris, daughter of Ira Harris, senator of New York, Loudonville residents. He took over in the Senate He was elected to the Senate seat vacated by William H. Seward, who became the Secretary of State. Next slide. This is Major Rathbone, her fiancé. Very unusual arrangement here. Clara Harris's fiancé is the son of her father's second wife. So Major Rathbone is actually her stepbrother. His father, by the way, Jared L. Rathbone, was a prosperous local businessman who was one time, between 1839 and 1841, mayor of the city of Albany, and later the president of Albany Medical College. Okay, next slide. This is a drawing that depicts the moment of the assassination. I told you earlier, Booth had jammed a stick into the outer door, and then he waited for the right moment. There was a little hole bored into the door, into the box, and he shoots the president in the back of the head, and it was a one-shot Derringer, so if something had gone wrong, then he would have had to try and use the backup plan, which was the knife. And again, I think this is part of his flair for the dramatic. I mean, he chooses the weapons of his action, and he doesn't choose a revolver that would offer him more than one opportunity. He chooses a Derringer one-shot. After he shoots Lincoln, Rathbone steps up and tries to restrain him. Booth, using the large knife, slashes a deep cut in Rathbone's arm, and then leaps from the stage, catching the boot, the spur of his left foot in the flags decorating. Next slide, please. There's a couple of more pictures of artist renderings. And again, this is a fanciful display where Booth is flying in the middle of the air and Lincoln is standing, you know, oh, I have such a headache. So again, and this is another part of the story, that some of the drawings that are made, there's a real care for detail. And then some of them, there are fanciful injections for entertainment that are put in. Next slide, please. Here's a shot that ran in Harper's. And Harper's was at the time a very well-regarded news magazine. So they strove for maximum accuracy in the depictions that they put into their magazine. Next picture, please. This is the top hat that the president wore at the theater that evening. Next slide. The rocker in which he was sitting. Next slide. And this is one picture of Booth's one-shot Derringer. And a second slide has the same gun, but in a different picture. So Booth lands on the stage, breaks his leg, and grasping the knife, clutching it high, he says, "Sic semper tyrannis, the South is avenged." This is very significant because it's the motto of Virginia, the Old Dominion. It also in Latin means "thus always to tyrants," and it also is evocative of the history of the theater, the Greek tragedies, the Greek plays, Shakespeare, assassinations in Julius Caesar, etc. And this is all part of the grand notion that Booth had of his act, the greatest act of his career. This is the knife, the dagger that he wielded, and the door behind. This is actually from the basement of Ford's Theater. I don't know if it's still there, but the last time I was there, a lot of this Lincoln stuff was in the basement of the theater. That is the actual door to the box, where there was a little hole bored so that he could look through. Next slide. This is Charles Leal. He's the first physician on the scene at Ford's Theater to tend to the stricken president. He's 23 years old, so he's a very young doctor. He also is the one who pronounces the wound mortal. And he's the one who makes a lot of the decisions about what is going to happen. He comes to a clear understanding that the president is going to die, and then it becomes an idea of, well, we can't control whether or not he's going to die, but we can control where he's going to die. And again, he's in a theater on Good Friday, and the theater, because of everything that happened, kind of has this feeling of a den of iniquity or a burlesque house. So Leal, among others, is the one who makes the decision to move him to the Peterson house across the street. Next slide. This is the second doctor who tended to him, Charles Sabin. And the third slide is the last doctor, the third doctor, and I got to make sure I read this name right. It's an unbelievable name. Dr. Albert Freeman Africanus King, who also tended to the stricken president and helped to transport the body across the street. Next slide, please. This is Miss Laura Keene, the star of the show, whose benefit was that evening at Ford's Theater. And in many respects, she's similar to Booth because she has a flair for the dramatic. She's an actress. And she has a clear understanding that there's an important historical event unfolding. And she wants to make sure that she assigns herself a starring role in it. So what she does, believe it or not, and again, it's all true, she gets a pitcher of water. And after Lincoln is killed and Booth quickly escapes, there's mayhem in the theater. The theater goers are running around. Nobody knows what's happened. People are saying, kill the assassin. They don't even realize he's no longer in the building. And there's just mayhem everywhere. And because she knows the layout of the theater, she knows a back way to get up to the booth where the president, the stricken president, lies. She doesn't have to wade through all of the people and all of the chaos. So she gets a pitcher of water, and this is her ticket into the room because she wants to provide some assistance. And once she's in the room with the pitcher of water, she makes an unbelievable and bizarre request, which Dr. Leal accedes to. It's of no medical benefit and can't help the president at all. She asks for and is granted permission to cradle the president's wounded head in her lap. And her dress is then besmirched with the president's blood, and this becomes a bizarre keepsake that, you know, she shows to people. I don't think the dress still exists, but the point is she did save it. And ultimately, you know, we've forgotten, in terms of pop culture, the names of most of the other people in the theater that night who were on the stage. You know, the most ardent students of the history of the theater can probably tell you about the other people that were on the bill that night. But Laura Keene has punched her ticket to immortality with this bizarre display. Next slide, please. This is a shot showing where the theater is located. The Peterson House is across the street where Lincoln dies, and this is the network of alleyways behind the theater where Booth is able to rapidly make his escape. The Herndon House here, this is where the assassins met for their last meeting the morning of the 14th, when Booth reveals the assassination plot and assigns the responsibilities. Okay, one more. Next slide, please. This is a larger shot of the area, which shows you how close all of these buildings were. We have here the Kirkwood House, which is the residency of Vice President Johnson. It's also where George Sarat had rented a room. The Willard Hotel was swamped with requests for visitors from people wanting to come to Washington, D.C. to attend, to view Lincoln's body and be a part of the ceremonies, to pay their respects after his death. And also at the Willard House was where General Grant and his wife were staying before they left Washington that day of the assassination. The National Hotel down here is where Booth stayed and where he was registered at the time of the assassination. And ironically, as I said earlier, during one of the failed kidnap attempts when they were trying to, in the tradition of highwaymen, they're trying to abduct President Lincoln as he traveled, Lincoln was actually giving a speech at the National Hotel that day. So it didn't work out. Mrs. Surratt's boarding house is over here. And the Seward House, Secretary of State, surprise, lives right across the street from the State Department. The War Department's here, the Navy Department here. Gideon Wells lives here, the Secretary of the Navy, and the Treasury Department of the White House. Everything is very closely packed, all of these buildings, all of these scenes. Next slide, please. This is what the presidential box looked like the day after the assassination. That's one of the really interesting things that Edwin M. Stanton does, is he gets a whole photo essay done of all of the scenes in the theater, and he thinks that this might be a help to get a clue to solve the crime and find the perpetrators. And the nice thing about it is it provides a documentation that's relatively editorial free. Next slide. This is what the booth looks like today, decorated with the same picture of Washington. Next slide, please. The two scenes side by side. Next slide. This is what the scene on the stage looked like of Our American Cousin. And they also did a kind of another bizarre thing, that they had the play, they had a run-through of the play the following day, with only like 2 people in the audience, Secretary Stanton and some other people. Again, they thought that maybe they would be able to get a clue of some kind about an answer. Next slide, please. This is the home where Secretary of State Seward lived. It's no longer in existence. I'm not sure when the picture was taken. David Harold guided Lewis Powell to this location on the night of Friday, April 14th, and he attacks Seward at the same time that Lincoln is being assassinated. Seward is recuperating from a carriage accident. He had cracked his jaw, cracked some ribs. He was in very bad shape. Lewis Powell shows up that night, and he's got a box that supposedly is medicine. And the Secretary of State's doctor had seen him earlier in the day, and now Lewis Powell shows up with this box, and he says he has to get in. He has to give the medicine personally. This is how he says, he has to give it personally. That's all a ruse to get in close enough so that he can kill Secretary of State Seward. And he's very persistent. But again, the idea of the medicine, that comes from Booth and Harold, because Harold in particular is familiar with how medicines are packaged. And frankly, the fact that he's able to make it all the way up the stairs before he arouses suspicion shows you that that was a very good plan. So once he gets into the house, now Powell has to figure out where in the house the Secretary of State is sleeping. Where is he located? So he keeps saying, I have to go up, I have to go up. I have to personally, I have to give him myself. And the Secretary's son, he may think he's dealing with an idiot who figured that when the doctor said give it to the Secretary, he meant give it to the Secretary. And he keeps saying, give it to me and tell me what has to be done, I can pass it along. And he manages to make it up the stairs, and Fanny Seward, the Secretary's daughter, is in the room with her father. She makes the mistake of cracking the door. And that provides enough information that now Powell knows where he is. So he starts down the stairs, and just when the Secretary's son lowers his guard, he pulls out a revolver that he has, and it misfires. So instead of, he panics. Instead of cocking the weapon and trying to fire it again, he uses it as a bludgeon. And he repeatedly smacks the Secretary's son over the head. And in fact, the first time he brings the weapon down, he breaks the firing pin, so now it can't be used as a gun. And this tremendous commotion is going on, and he finally makes his way into the room, and as he's stabbing Secretary of State Seward, the Secretary's daughter opens the window and screams. And this is all David Harold outside needs to hear. He takes off. He runs for the hills. Because Powell, in going into the house, hasn't let anybody else know that there's another person outside. So as far as they know, he's the only person involved in this. And there's also a very heroic chapter of a lowly private, who's on the scene to protect the Secretary of State, who does yeoman service and is thusly and justifiably honored. And we'll get to that in a bit. Next slide, please. This is William H. Seward, a drawing of William H. Seward and his daughter, Fanny. Date unknown. Next slide, please. This is what the Secretary of State looked like before the attack. This is well before he was Secretary of State. And then this is what he looked like after. You could see that there are scars. And he had, as I said, he'd been injured in a riding accident, a carriage accident, and he had a splint over his cheek because his jaw was broken, some ribs were broken and all this. And so when Powell is bringing this knife down on him, that's how he tried to kill him, stabbing, it keeps getting deflected by this apparatus that he's wearing. So it blunts and diffuses some of the energy, but he does have substantial wounds that you can see from the picture. Next slide. This is the star of the show here, George Foster Robinson, Major. He was George Foster Robinson, rather. He became a major. That was the highest rank he made in the Army, and he died in 1907. He's the one, as a private, assigned the responsibility of protecting Secretary of State Seward. Next slide. This is a special award minted for him. This is the favorite thing I found preparing for this presentation. This is a special medal awarded to George Foster Robinson Private at the time, he saved Secretary Seward's life by grappling with Lewis Powell. This is the joint resolution in Congress. Wednesday, March 1, 1871, joint resolution for the relief of George F. Robinson, 8th Regiment Maine Volunteers. Be it resolved by the Senate and House of Representatives of the United States of America and Congress assembled that the Secretary of Treasury be and is hereby directed to pay George F. Robinson, later private in the 8th Regiment of Maine Volunteers, the sum of $5,000 out of any money in the Treasury of the United States not otherwise appropriated. Section 2. And be it further resolved that the Secretary of the Treasury be and he is hereby directed to cause to be prepared and presented to the said George F. Robinson a gold medal with appropriate devices and inscriptions commemorative of the heroic conduct of the said Robinson on the 14th day of April, 1865, in saving the life of the Honorable William H. Seward, then Secretary of State of the United States. The expense of said medal to be paid out of any money in the Treasury not otherwise appropriated. You'll note here we have a profile of Seward lying, convalescing in bed. And here's Robinson, and here's Powell, and there's the knife. And this is, and I don't know where this piece is today, whether it's privately held by the family, by the descendants, or if it's part of the National Archives. But I just thought that that was kind of a neat touch to it. Next picture. This is the Navy Yard Bridge. This was the bridge on which Booth and Herold made their escape the night of April the 14th. Booth makes two errors. And the thing with this guy is everything was a performance. You know, you got to realize that Washington, D.C. is in a celebratory mood, and his whole thing is he kills the president and then wants to get away fast before anybody knows what he's done. And so his immediate thing is, he has this idea if he gets out of Washington, he'll be safe. So he gets to the bridge, and Washington is still a city under curfew. Even though the war has supposedly ended, there's all kinds of plots and rumors of things going on. So it's a city under curfew, and the curfew was 9 o'clock. Nobody's supposed to cross this bridge after 9 o'clock. And it's like 10:30 now. And so Booth rides up, you know, to do a performance. And the fellow, the sentry on guard is a guy by the name of Silas T. Cobb. And he asks Booth his business, and he says he's a friend. And, you know, he's just very confident and cocky. And, you know, he manages to talk his way past the guard who says, okay, go ahead and cross. He asks him his name, and he says Booth. That's his first mistake. He gives his actual name. And then the second mistake is he asks him where you're going. He says Beantown, which is in the general vicinity of where he was going. So he gives his real name, and he provides information about where he's going to be going. Now, Herold, for his part, shortly thereafter, when he asks why he didn't leave town earlier, he gives the perfect answer that no soldier would ever turn his back on. He says, I was with a woman, and I couldn't get away earlier. So he, too, is allowed to pass. And the interesting thing is the horses were rented. The two horses that they used were rented, and the rental agent had told them that they had to be returned by 9 o'clock. So as Herold is riding away from the Seward house, leaving Powell to fend for himself, the rental agent sees him on the horse and notices him and says, hey, you, that horse should have been in an hour ago. And so Herold sees him and immediately turns around and gallops the other way to escape. And now this guy follows, and he gets to the bridge after the two of them have passed. And the sentry now, you know, his attitude is, I've already bent the rules twice. I'm going to get into trouble. So he wants to continue the pursuit to try and follow Herold. And the sentry says to him, if you cross the bridge, you don't come back until sunrise. He's not prepared to do that. But what he does do, what's terrific in its own right, is he follows through and he files a police report with the authorities over 2 stolen horses. And in the course of filing his paperwork, he hears that Booth is a suspect in the murder of the president. And he says, oh, well, Booth, Herold, and Sarat rented horses for me together all the time. So within an hour or so of the assassination, they've got 3 of the conspirators linked through the rental agent for the horses.
What river is that?
This is the Anacostia. This is the 11th Street Bridge today, and that's Anacostia, Maryland on the other side. I'm not sure what the date of this photograph is, but I would imagine it's sometime contemporaneous. Next slide, please. These two shots show the Peterson house, the home where Lincoln died. I would imagine this is probably late 19th, early 20th century, and this is a contemporary picture of the same scene. And the mayhem in the theater across the street. They don't know where they're going to take the president. And they're saying, well, we should take him back to the White House so we can die in the White House. No, the roads, they're muddy and ruddy, and the travel will kill him. He'll die in the coach. And there was even some discussion, there's a bar next door. Maybe they'll take him there. Well, you're not going to let him die in the theater. You're going to take him to a bar and let him die there. That's a good plan. So eventually they take him out into the street, and there's a throng of people. The word spreads fast, and everybody who's celebrating the end of the war, they hear about what's happening, and they all want to be there to witness history and be a part of it, and just to kind of collectively experience the moment. And so there's a massive crowd. It's not easy to get across the street. And so they get out into the street, and they don't know where they're going to take him, and he's kind of in limbo, and they don't know where they're going. And finally, one of the boarders in the Peterson house says, take him in here. And so they bring him in. It's kind of not planned at all, and that's where he winds up. Next slide, please. This is the parlor in the Peterson home, and this is where Mary Todd Lincoln was consoled in the period of time, 7 or 8 hours between the time that the president got there and the time that he actually died. And Dr. Leal, because he's aware that this is a historic event, they're taking very careful notes about the president's vital signs as he is lying on his deathbed. Next slide, please. This is a pillow that has a blood stain that is said to be the pillow on which was on the bed, which Lincoln's head was on. Next slide, please. And this is an actual photograph of the room. Now take a look at this room. Very, very small room. Certainly no more than 3 people could fit in there comfortably, or 4 people could fit in there comfortably. And the bed is so small that Lincoln is laid onto it diagonally, because he's 6'4". So they put his head up in one corner and his feet are scrunched up in another corner. And ironically, this bed was used by John Wilkes Booth. It was a rooming house, a room right across the street from the theater. And one of his acting colleagues was boarding in the room at the time, and he came by for a visit at some point prior to the assassination and took a nap on the bed. So it's one of the quirks of history that the bed in which Lincoln died, his assassin had used at one point. Next slide, please. Now note in this picture, this is an artist's rendering of the same scene. And now the room has become much larger, and there are a dozen people there. And I think that, this is somebody who wasn't there, who didn't see it, draws this picture. But now, the mother of them all is the famous painting by Alonzo Chappell of the same scene. Now we see this room has been transformed into a grand parlor of a mansion. And we see virtually the entire important cast of characters from Lincoln's administration, including Secretary of State Seward, who, even if there hadn't been an assassination attempt on his life that night, he was not going to be in that room because he was still convalescing from his riding accident. And I think one of the really important lessons that these 3 pictures show, next slide please, shows all 3 on the same. This is really the first event where photography is able to document without editorializing and without bias, either political or point of view. I mean, up until this point, historical events have been witnessed by people and written about. And witnesses to these events would write their accounts. And, they all had their vested interest in making themselves look good. So that's a source of bias. And then artists who would come and read these depictions would then draw drawings of the things that they had read. So now you have another level of interpretation on top of a level of interpretation. And so this last painting, shows a very grand scene, which no way, not even close. So that's another important lesson, I think, of the whole story. Next slide.
Welcome to Channel 17, the Town of Colonie Government Channel.